Review, voice leading errors. So in this video, we're going to review some of the voice leading errors that you learned about in 191. I'm going to emphasize here, this is complete review of what you learned in 191. So you might actually find it pretty useful to go through your notes from last year. I am going to have some 4-part writing in this course, but not nearly as much as what you did last year. I'm going to have a lot more emphasis on analysis in particular. But do keep in mind we're sometimes going to go with this model. Also keep in mind that if I don't specify what style I want you to write something in, assume that it's 4-part. 4-part is the default unless I tell you otherwise. So in 4-part writing, we're essentially writing for voice. Soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. 4-part writing is used when teaching harmony concepts simply because it gives a good framework for teaching students what notes need to resolve and in what particular ways. The truth is when we actually compose, we break a lot of these rules, but at least we sort of understand the logic behind them before we get to that idea of sort of expanding beyond and then breaking some of the conventions. So I'm going to talk about some of the reasons for the rules as well as I go through in this video. Probably the biggest rule that you were emphasizing last year was parallel fifths and octaves. So what is a parallel fifth or octave? Well, let's use the octave as the example here.
A parallel octave occurs when two voices form a perfect octave with one another. When these two voices move, they move to another perfect octave together, specifically in the same voice pair. The motion from one perfect octave to the next is via parallel motion. Parallel means that the two voices move in the same direction by the same size of interval.
Dr. Birch may have talked about a concept last year called anti-parallels. Those are when you have two octaves in a row that go opposite directions. They're still not great, but they're not as bad as a parallel octave. Parallel octaves in and of themselves are not a problem when we're dealing with something like orchestral music that has many, many voices. So for example, if we have 10 instruments playing at once, we kind of don't care if they're parallels. But when we're dealing with a smaller number of voices, the problem with using parallels is they basically reduce the independence of the voices. What I mean by that is it sounds like, for example, your alto and soprano are just hooked together and moving the same way, and then they're not really doing their own independent thing. In 4-part writing, we really want each voice to be doing its own independent thing, just from a variety perspective. And so we really, in 4-part writing, try to avoid this idea of two voices continuously moving in the same direction by the same interval. The other reason why we tend to avoid parallel fifths and parallel octaves is that those particular intervals, being perfect, tend to produce a much stronger kind of sonority than some of the other interval types. They tend to stick out a lot more, and they tend to actually ring. They tend to actually lock into sort of your harmonic overtones a lot more easily. And so if you're doubling those notes, you can really emphasize them in a much more stronger way than you want to when you're only writing in 4 voices. Again, if you're writing more than 4 voices, this is less of a problem. So you may have also learned of a related concept last year. I'm going to call this a direct fifth or direct octave, but I believe last year in 191 you probably called this a hidden fifth or a hidden octave. A direct fifth or octave occurs when two voices land on a fifth or octave and they're moving in similar motion. Similar motion means same direction. It's not as bad as a parallel fifth or octave because they're not moving by the same interval. But landing on that fifth or octave, once again, because those are perfect sonorities, they're going to stand out a lot more. So you'll be allowed to do these with inside voices, but you should avoid them with the bass, and you should particularly avoid them between the bass and soprano. I'm also going to say that they're totally okay as long as one of your voices are moving by step. If both voices are moving by leap, that's when they really become prominent. So just to summarize, direct fifths and octaves are okay if one voice is moving by step, or if they're in the inside voices, the tenor and the alto. They are not okay if both voices move by leap, and if it's involving the bass in any kind of way. Next area to review, you probably talked last year too about the typical ranges of each of the parts. You can see on screen what we typically expect. I'm going to say for the purposes of this class, you can go one note beyond on either edge, but you really shouldn't go beyond there. At that point, you're hitting a range that singers just can't do based on their voice assignments. Next, I want to talk a little bit about voice crossing and voice overlap. These are two related but kind of different concepts. Voice crossing is the idea that, for example, you have a tenor that's higher than your alto voice, or vice versa. And so from a listener perspective, it can be hard to tell who's the soprano, who's the alto, who's the tenor, and who's the bass. In 4-part writing, we want to be clear who is singing any of those parts at any given time. A voice overlap is kind of a softer version of that. It occurs when we're looking over the span of 2 chords, And we have crossing happening, but it's on the next beat. So for example, the example that I'm showing on screen right now, in our second chord, we can see that our tenor has gone higher than what the alto had in the previous chord. So again, this is not as bad as a simultaneous voice crossing, but it just blurs a little bit who's singing any particular line of music at any given time. I want to talk a little bit about doublings as well, because I'm going to relax the doubling rules compared to what you learned last year. Last year, you were given very, very fixed ideas of what to double in particular chords. I believe you were told that you can double root in some of the primary function chords, or in some chords like 2 that you might want to double the third. In this course, I'm going to be way more flexible about it. In this course, you can double anything you want to, as long as it's not a note that has to resolve in a special way. And the reason for that is if it has to resolve in a special way, you can't do that to 2 of the same note without creating parallels. So feel free to double your root, your third, or your fifth. It doesn't matter. You probably also learned last year that you have some options for spelling chords when you're in difficult situations. One policy that I'm going to have throughout this course is that chords must include their root, but in some cases you can actually omit the fifth of the chord. So if you have the root and the third, that's enough to be able to tell the identity of the chord. So feel free to do that in your writing this year. Last year, you were also taught a fair bit about what to do with leading tones. That is, the 7th note of the scale. In minor in particular, there are very specific ways that we treat the leading tone. So you might remember that in minor, you were told to raise your leading tone. I'm going to modify that, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the harmonic function unit as well as the sequence unit. So do be aware of that. We're going to have some changes compared to last year. Last year, you were taught just kind of the basic understanding. This year, we're going to talk about these chords and these notes much more specifically in different contexts. Because truthfully, it turns out that you actually raise that note in some contexts and you lower that note in other contexts. Here are your basic rules for raising your leading tone in Music 292. You're going to raise your leading tone whenever you're in a dominant function chord, 5 chord or a 7 chord. You are not going to raise your leading tone if it is not a dominant function chord. So the main place that will happen is in your 3 chord. Do not raise your leading tone in your 3 chord. We'll discuss other exceptions to this in the next few weeks. One rule that's pretty universal, though, is that when you're using scale degree 7, particularly the raised version of it, you need to resolve that note in a special way. And that special way is that you must resolve it up by semitone to the tonic. In other words, scale degree 7 must move to scale degree 1. You were taught last year that at cadences you could leap down to the 5. I'm going to ask you not to do that in this course, and I will explain in a few weeks why that's the case. We're going to talk about a concept called transferred resolution. So in this course, resolve scale degree 7 to scale degree 1 at all times, unless given instructions otherwise. The very last thing I want to talk about in terms of voice leading are intervals. So you were taught probably last year that there's certain intervals that you should avoid. And this is actually going to be a pretty strong emphasis of this course because of the new chromatic chords that we're going to learn this year. So for a Music 292 perspective, I would say you want to double check your melodic intervals. In other words, your intervals moving in each voice. I'm going to sometimes call these linear intervals or horizontal intervals because on the page, that's essentially how they're going to be written out. Your rule for this year is going to be that consonant intervals are always allowed melodically. So thirds, sixths, totally fine. Perfect fifths, perfect octaves, also totally fine. But you need to be a little bit more careful with dissonant intervals. Major and minor seconds are totally fine because there's such a small distance, they're never going to create you problems. But dissonant intervals that are larger than that are going to stick out. And to be honest, from a singer perspective, they're really, really hard to pitch. So we avoid writing them, particularly in 4-part style. So that would be, for example, major and minor sevenths are very, very hard for singers to pitch. Tritones, the term that I'm going to use for diminished fifths and augmented fourths, are very hard for singers to pitch. So we do not want to write them horizontally. That rule is also going to apply to diminished and augmented intervals, regardless of the size. Although we're going to talk about some exceptions to that as we go through when we learn new chords. This includes the augmented second that typically occurs in minor keys between scale degree 6 and scale degree 7. That is a concept that you learned last year. So we're going to take that and we're going to essentially apply that rule more broadly now. So there's your review of voice leading rules from 191. There is an entire walkthrough of all this in the course pack. It's 2 or 3 pages long and gives you a breakdown of what all the rules are. So I'm going to suggest you use that as you're getting corrected exercises back throughout the year to be able to figure out what you've done wrong and how to fix some of your problems. Thanks, then. I'll see you in the next video.